to enhancing their opportunities for working off of campus. I've met with the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration on that issue, Mr. Speaker, as well a few weeks ago. I'm pleased to see that the federal government is going to move forward with regards to that issue. And Mr. Speaker, we look forward to continually working with our universities to ensure more opportunities for immigrants coming to study here in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, 15% increase. That's a huge increase for an international undergraduate student. That's enough to force international students away from our province, and it runs completely counter to the aims of the immigration strategy, which has just been adopted. My question again is, why is the Minister of Immigration content to drive these desirable students away from our shores?
The honourable Minister of Immigration.
No, as I said, Mr. Speaker, in fact, that's one of the top agenda items that we put forward to the federal government with respect to providing opportunities for international students to be able to work off of campus, Mr. Speaker. We felt very strongly about that issue, and I'm pleased to see that the federal minister and his colleagues have seen fit to move forward on that. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the tuition question, Mr. Speaker, I believe that would be better appropriately answered by my colleague, the Minister of Education, and I will refer it to him.
Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, the tuition fees are set by the Board of Governors at Dalhousie University. As members and the host would know, that we entered into a memorandum of understanding with the 11 institutions in the province to see a cap on the increase of undergraduate tuition fees. We have promised 3 years of stable funding in the universities. In return, they have promised to reduce expenses. Part of that memorandum of understanding, too, Mr. Speaker, is that they have agreed to work on credit transfer between community college and universities, as well as to increase the number of underrepresented from members of populations which are underrepresented.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on your final supplementary.
Well, I appreciate the answer from both ministers, but you're both missing the point. You're talking about the MOU, you're talking about working off campus, and you're talking about credit transfers. I'm talking about high tuition fees that are discouraging students from coming here. What I think the message is that both ministers need to work together to make this happen. It's not something that happens from one or the other. We have an immigration strategy, and this is counter to it. And I'd like the ministers, both ministers, to do more than dance around the subject. Specifically, and I would like to go back to the Minister of Immigration, will you work with your counterpart, the Minister of Education, to see that the universities try and hold the line on tuition fees for international students? Thank you.
The honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I can assure you that the Minister of Education and I work very closely with regards to issues dealing to immigration and post-secondary students. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll forward it on to the Minister of Education to elaborate on that.
Order, please. Order, please. I think one answer would suffice. The honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley. Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment and Labour. Mr. Speaker, current legislation protecting waterways in Nova Scotia is 20 years old. It has a very narrow focus on public drinking water quality and watercourse alterations. It does not cover other threats to water quality such as air pollution, erosion, land drainage, and storm sewers. There are not even regulations under the Act. Our waterways are at risk, and this is particularly significant for Dartmouth, well recognized as the City of Lakes. My question to the Minister, will you make a commitment today to immediately upgrade legislation, regulations, and policies to protect Nova Scotia's waterways?
Good question. Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We certainly have updated policies, and to ensure that we protect our waterways in the province of Nova Scotia, there's continuing consultation with the stakeholders involved and all people in the province of Nova Scotia to make sure that we will bring forward amendments to the Environment Act that will be sound and will protect the environment.
Honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to differ. Scientific knowledge and environmental standards have changed considerably in 20 years. And currently, storm drains and land runoffs are dumping pollutants and sediments directly into Dartmouth's waterways, overloading whatever capacity they have to maintain quality and appearance. And this is true right across the province. Will the minister commit to tighter controls and higher standards and consequences to lessen the impact of man-made drainage into waterways?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, we're continually looking at improving the rules of the road and the regulations that we have in the province of Nova Scotia, and we appreciate some of these structures are old and have been installed for a long period of time, and we're working with municipalities and others to make sure that they're upgraded and that they meet the current standards.
Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, and your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, let me give you a current example from my constituency of Dartmouth South, Portland Valley. The current and proposed developments around Morris and Russell Lakes in Portland Estates are an example of best intentions not being enough to protect the lakes. The municipality, residents, and developers have taken a number of progressive steps to balance lake protection and necessary development. Yet streams and storm sewers will continue to feed oil, grease, manure, sediment, and fertilizers into those lakes. I ask the minister, what is his department doing to prevent this from happening?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, the department is continually monitoring issues, responding to requests to try and ensure that we keep the best possible quality of the environment in the province.
The Honourable Member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transport and Public Works. Residents of Digby Annapolis have become increasingly frustrated over the conditions of road. Most all of our roads are pretty bad, but the Weymouth Mills Road, as one example, is broken up in so many pieces it's gone to a gravel road. Personally, I've never seen a road broken up this bad before in my life. My question to the minister is, will any of the roads in the Digby Annapolis be paved or repaired this year?
Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, I imagine that there will be some repairs and some construction in the Digby area.
The Honourable Member for Digby Annapolis on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, our gravel roads have become mud roads because the department has been using low-class gravel for the past 7 years. They have done this to save a little money, only which will cost us more in the end. The runoff is filling the ditches with mud, and so when it rains, the water causes flooding, and in turn, deterioration to these roads is even worse. Will the minister please indicate whether there will be a change in the quality of gravel purchased for the dirt roads of Digby Annapolis?
Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, we have a specific requirements and specs for gravel, and as far as I know, Mr. Speaker, that those standards are being rigidly enforced right across the province. So, Mr. Speaker, if there is indeed a defective product being provided to the Department of Transportation, then the Department of Transportation will take action to have it rectified.
I'll member for Digby Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, because of the runoff, it's clogging our ditches, and the alder bushes are growing and causing visibility problems for drivers. Last year, some money was given to that local department, but the people have seen very little done from it. Will the Minister of Transport make a commitment to look into the plan for the removal of alders this year in the Digby Annapolis area?
Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the honourable member will be delighted to learn that we are putting more money into the operational budget this year and more money into the capital budget, and that will result in an increase in the activities by the Department of Transportation during the summer construction season.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, in this question period, the Minister for Community Services tabled what can only be considered, Mr. Speaker, a disgraceful attempt to justify the policy of this government, which robs people of their future. He attempted to tell the members of this House that among other things, those single parents wishing to attend university could get subsidies in the amount of $3,862.50 for childcare. Well, Mr. Speaker, what he didn't say is that those subsidies aren't available because there aren't any more to be had, and secondly, you can only get them if you have the additional $3,000 you have to pay on top of that in order to access childcare. So my question to the minister is, when will he give up with these pathetic justifications for that policy and bring forward a policy which will actually allow single parents to access the university education that will allow them to meet their potential?
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as I was speaking to this earlier, I am proud to be a Canadian. I'm proud to be a Nova Scotian. We have a tremendous social safety net in place. That social safety net, which incidentally captured in this letter, was published in the Chronicle Herald and the Daily News. The honourable member did not respond to it at that time. And Mr. Speaker, the support, depending on the number of people in the family, goes up to almost $32,000 for a family of three, a single-parent family of three that wants to attend university, that takes advantage of the social safety net that's available. Mr. Speaker, that is substantial.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has about 15 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Minister of Education to please explain to the Minister of Community Services which student loans are interest-free?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Jamie? Don.
Time allotted for question period has expired. Maybe the Honourable Minister will explain that outside. Order, please. Before we go to government business, the Honourable Premier, I would ask the Honourable Premier to table documents that he read from earlier when he responded to questions from the Honourable Member from Halifax Citadel. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Which documents are we referring to?
Whatever documents the Honourable Premier read from. I'd ask you to table those at your...
I tabled the letter from the Leader of the Conservative Party.
I believe it was in response to questions in regards to VLTs from British Columbia or something.
What I read, Mr. Speaker, was an excerpt from the website of the Attorney General of the Province of British Columbia.
The Honourable Premier will table that, please.
Okay, well, I'll have to get a copy.
Thank you. Yep. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations on introduction.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce to you and to members of the House in the gallery opposite from Sackville, a constituent of the Sackville-Cobequid, Stephen Highland, who is here watching the proceedings of the House. And I'd ask members to give him the usual warm welcome when we get visitors.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Citadel.
Just on a point of order, when I asked the question concerning VLTs, the Premier made reference to, I think, an Officer Don Smith or someone like that. I'm assuming that he has some material that's outside the website that relates to Officer Smith. That was also the...
Order, please. I believe the only thing that's required tabling in the House is something the member actually reads from, not something they refer to. If anybody reads from a document in the House, they're required to table it, if they directly read from it. Thank you.
That's understood.
Honourable Government House Leader on government business.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, before I call the business, I'd like to respond to the question from the member for Fairview, and just simply tell him that that I have no indication that it's the most dangerous intersection in Nova Scotia, but however, that intersection is under consideration in the current construction year for improvements. It will depend on the budget, Mr. Speaker, and that's the best that I can do. Mr. Speaker, would you please call the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 147, the Youth Justice Act. It was an adjourned debate.
Bill number 147. The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to speak for a bit on this piece of legislation. I think last time on Tuesday we closed debate I think right at 5:59. I just got up and moved adjournment, so I haven't had a chance to really start my comments, and I wanted to take some time today. Mr. Speaker, this is legislation that is in many ways long overdue, but I think it's important that we understand that this is a very small component of a much bigger plan that we have not seen from this government. This government has, until the introduction of this legislation, been very political, has been very wry at pointing the finger at another level of government, the federal government. And in many ways, Mr. Speaker, that's been based on the fact that the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the federal piece of legislation, frankly, is a piece of legislation that does need changing. But I think we need to understand that in this province, in this country, you must not only be tough on crime, you must be tough on the causes of crime as well, Mr. Speaker. And that is why this legislation addresses a component of that, but doesn't address the need for this government to have a plan for ensuring that the youth of this province are provided with alternatives. Because let's be frank, in many cases, Mr. Speaker, what the youth of this province are doing, you have to beg the question, why are they active in criminal activity, those that are, Mr. Speaker? Why are they stealing vehicles? Why are they joyriding? Why are they street racing? Why are they involved in these activities with motor vehicles that are causing, in some cases, obviously, as we all know in the McAvoy case, the death of an innocent woman? In the case of other situations, passengers in the vehicle. In the case of other situations, Mr. Speaker, the drivers of some of these vehicles. These are situations, Mr. Speaker, that are very dangerous. But it goes back to a simple question. Why are the youth of this province doing this? They're no different than they are in New Brunswick or British Columbia or Hawaii or California. This is a problem throughout North America. Maybe it's a problem in other parts of the world as well. I think it's particularly a problem in North America because of our love of the motor vehicle, because of our need in many cases, at least given the geography of Canada, the need for motor vehicles. Mr. Speaker, that I think is an issue that needs to really be asked. Why is it that youth are doing this? Now, there's a lot of answers to that question, and I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, but I think we can at least begin to look at that and say a few things. That in many ways, by the time a youth is in a position to commit a crime or commit a violation of a Motor Vehicle Act, we've already lost. If they are in a position where they are making those choices, then they never clearly did understand that there are consequences to negative activity, that there are consequences to criminal activity. And I heard the Minister of Justice today on CBC Radio saying, we have to make sure that the youth understand that there are consequences for their activity, criminal activity, violation of provincial offenses. They have to understand that there are consequences. I don't disagree. Our party supports this legislation because, well, to some extent, we suggested it 4 months ago. This is legislation that we said was necessary because it has to be more than just a federal act. It has to be a concerted effort on behalf of this province to address the issues that are facing our youth. So consequences need to be understood. And those consequences, Madam Speaker, involve us knowing that the youth of this province do make choices, and when they make bad choices, punishment will occur. Now, these are I will say, very simple and very limited in their approach. Suspending a license for a greater period of time where there's a violation of a criminal code offense from 2 years to 5 years, Madam Speaker. Increasing the ability to impound vehicles where there's street racing. These are things our party suggested back in January and in February, and back in the fall after the McAvoy matter. Because this minister for months was saying it's the federal government, it's the Youth Criminal Justice Act that needs to be fixed. Again, my personal opinion is, having read that legislation, it is the most prescriptive piece of legislation I have seen. It's a piece of legislation that tells police officers and crown attorneys and judges what they can and cannot do. These are professionals. These are professionals that should have some flexibility, some ability to do their job. Yet this piece of legislation dictates to them who can go to jail, who can be remanded, waiting for trial, and who they have to set free without any conditions. Doesn't give them any flexibility in their job to judge individuals. It lays down rules based on which type of offenses. When you provide prescriptive legislation like that, Madam Speaker, you are obviously setting yourself up for problems, because inherently in our system, if we don't give some flexibility to the professionals in the justice system, the police officers, the Crown attorneys, the judges, then of course there'll be circumstances that come up. So what we did with the Youth Criminal Justice Act, we said only in violent offenses will a youth be able to be remanded in jail or be sentenced to jail. Those are the only circumstances, a violent offense. Now, I understand that there's a theory that that's a good thing. But what happens when it's a property offense like stealing a motor vehicle and joyriding and people die? Is that a violent offense? Is that a property offense? Well, the federal government, when they passed this bill back in 2003, when it finally became law, said, no, that's a property offense, so they won't go to jail if they steal a car. Yet people die when they steal cars. People can die, joyriding, street racing, car chases, people get killed. So now we're saying, and I applaud the minister for going to the federal government as one component, saying that that has to be changed. Well, this legislation is so prescriptive that we found, and people found loopholes that resulted in death in this province and in other parts of the country. So now we have to fix that. Let's be clear, and I've said this on the record here and in the media, that that's not going to happen tomorrow. That's not going to happen next week. I don't think it'll happen next year. This will take a very long period of time to change the Youth Criminal Justice Act. And there's a reason for that. Not only that the federal bureaucracy can be cumbersome and it'll take a while for it to happen, Madam Speaker, but also because we have a very interesting parliament where, in my recollection, when that Youth Criminal Justice Act passed, it was actually changed to be less, how would I put it, reactive, less weighing on the side of punishment. Because the members in the Bloc Québécois and I'm told the culture of Quebec has a very different approach to criminality, a very different approach to rehabilitation, and they wanted to see a piece of legislation that gave them the ability to rehabilitate as compared to punish. We can have a debate about that if we wish, but the fact is that in this legislation, there were compromises made in Parliament with members of the Bloc Québécois to reflect the culture of Quebec, and as a result, we have legislation that does not necessarily reflect the ability to provide consequences to those youth violating that act. Where does that leave us? Well, in a federation, in a confederation, Madam Speaker, of course we have to make compromises. We have to reflect the culture of Quebec. We have to reflect the culture of English Canada and Nova Scotia. And maybe this act made some compromises that have affected, on a very personal basis, people in this province. But Madam Speaker, we need to actually look at where and what this province can do. We're in this House, we're not in the Federal House of Commons, so we are here to talk about what this province should be doing with regard to youth criminal justice matters. This minister has gone on a speaking tour through the winter. I heard it recently he was in Cape Breton at, I believe it was the annual general meeting of the Minister of Energy, pounding the table saying that I am tough on justice. I will make sure that youth in this province do not get away with these horrible crimes that they are committing. Yet, this is his answer. In this legislature, this is his answer. This is one tiny component of what needs to be done to address the issue of crime involving youth. It will address, to some extent, a couple of small points. Street racing is a crime under the criminal code. If you do it, your car will be impounded. If you loan your car to someone, if you let your child borrow a car and they do street racing, it can be impounded. That's good. We recommended that, amongst other things. Unfortunately, this minister picked that and forgot about a lot of the other things we've discussed, Madam Speaker. If you are convicted of a criminal code offense, most likely criminal negligence causing injury, criminal negligence causing death, maybe manslaughter, depending on the circumstances, reckless driving, dangerous driving, I get them mixed up, which one's motor vehicle and which one is criminal, but one of those two is criminal code. If you commit those offenses, then you can have higher suspensions of your license. Again, no problem with that. I support the legislation as far as it goes. The problem is it does not go far enough, Madam Speaker. What else are we doing? There are things that can be done. There are things that can be done to address this issue in a way that ensures that we are not only saying that we are going to punish youth who commit crimes, that there are consequences. That is important. That's the tough on crime component. But this government has forgotten the tough on causes of crime component, and it is foursquare in their responsibility. Under the Constitution, the federal government deals with criminal matters. This province deals with health, civil rights, property rights. They deal with the things that we can do to ensure that our children, our youth, don't get in those circumstances, Madam Speaker. And there's a long list of them. So let's talk a little bit about some of them. Let's talk about the fact that youth in this province have do not have good opportunity to access mental health services. I know in my own riding where I've had mothers come into my office with 8-year-old children who've been kicked out of school because of behavioral problems, yet they cannot get the services they need. That 8-year-old child who cannot get the help that that child needs, an 8-year-old kicked out of school, Madam Speaker, for the year because that child cannot be controlled in the classroom. Clearly that child has issues, mental health issues, behavioral issues that need to be addressed, Madam Speaker. But instead of addressing them at 8, we wait until they're 12. And at 12, and this is a good example because I had another child, I had people in the community come to me because I had a 12-year-old in my riding who was doing some serious damage in the community, property damage again. I remember going to the police officers and saying, well, can't you, if and when he does this again, and he did do it again, you release him with conditions of a curfew, conditions that would ensure that that child will at least have some parameters put on him, that he'll understand that there's consequences for property offenses, and then if it happens, breaching those orders, you have the power to do things. Well, they came back to me and said, that would have worked fine under the Young Offenders Act. I can't believe people are actually thinking the Young Offenders Act. They dream of the days of the Young Offenders Act, Madam Speaker, because the Young Offenders Act actually gave the police and crowns and judges more power than this act does. Under the Young Offenders Act, they would have been able to take that 12-year-old child who committed a property offense, who was wreaking havoc through a community. They would have been able to arrest, provide conditions like curfew, keeping the peace, staying away from certain individuals, release them back into the community. If the child violated those orders, they'd have powers to fix that too. But under this Youth Criminal Justice Act, Madam Speaker, this piece of legislation, they can't even do that. In a property offense, he has to be released without conditions. No curfew, no keeping the peace, no ability to say that that child has to stay away from other people or other certain locations. Well, Madam Speaker, clearly, that 8-year-old child who doesn't get the mental health help becomes the 12-year-old child who is showing symptoms, no longer just behavioral problems acting out in class, now some serious property offenses. That's the 15-year-old child that's in stealing vehicles and becoming violent. So you see a pattern. It takes years, yes. But that 8-year-old child, when I have the mother in my office saying, I need help, my child isn't getting the help they need, becomes the 12-year-old child who's acting out and the police hands are handcuffed, pardon the pun, from being able to do anything, and that becomes the 15-year-old child who commits crimes that end up, in some circumstances, unfortunately, people dying. And Madam Speaker, that is the chronology of what's happening unless this government does something about it. And this piece of legislation, as I said, is one tiny cog in that machinery that can help ensure that our youth don't end up at 15 and 16 making bad choices that result in criminal activity or motor vehicle violations that end up forcing and unfortunately having people die. Well, Madam Speaker, there are other things that can be done. I talked about mental health services that need to be beefed up. I don't hear that from this Minister of Justice. I don't hear that from this government. What about recreational services? You know, I mean, it's broad-ranging. I have a community that's developing, a community that has practically tripled in population in the past 15 years, Madam Speaker, 20 years. So I can go through new subdivisions in my community, and I got elected in 1998. There were a lot of young children in there. Well, those children are now reaching 12 and 13 years of age, and there's nowhere for them to go. There are no recreational services. There's no, quite frankly, there's not a spare piece of land, because the planning that we allow cities to do, because we have a municipal government act that allows them to do it, result in no green space for our children, result in no parks for our children, so that they have no place to go and have recreation. They don't have the ability to pay for basketball, because we have a piece of legislation the government hasn't even proclaimed that would allow basketball courts in schools to be free for them in the evenings. We don't have legislation that ensures that there's more green space for our children. We don't have a program to ensure that our children can afford to ensure that organized sports like baseball or soccer or hockey or basketball are cost effective, are cheap enough so that those who need it can actually access it. There are other kids that are at risk. Let's be frank. The ones that come from families where they are maybe aren't making so much money. They can't afford hockey. They can't afford basketball. They can't afford to go to the mall every Friday. They can't afford to use the bus in many cases to go to places where maybe they could access those services. Well, Madam Speaker, those are the children that are at risk of causing the concerns that this minister likes to yell about and say he's going to get tough with. But if we actually invested in those children when they were 2 or 5 or 8 or 10 or 12, we may not be in the circumstances we are today, where we have to ensure that we're going to suspend their license, we're going to impound their cars, we're going to demand a new Youth Criminal Justice Act. Every child should have that opportunity, Madam Speaker, to know early on what consequences are, and that when you make bad decisions, there are consequences. And you know what? This is a very personal issue for me, because I have a 4-year-old daughter who is, I must say, is one at this stage in life. I'm sure she's not even 4, she'll be 4 in May. But Madam Speaker, I see at this age, she's a rambunctious one. I like to say the devil is in her, because she challenges us in a way our first son never did. But Madam Speaker, we've said to ourselves, if we don't nip this in the bud now, if she does not at the age of 3 and 4 understand that you get rewarded for good behavior and that there is punishment and that there are consequences for bad behavior, Madam Speaker, then we know what the problems will be later in life. And that is something that I would hope everyone would understand. But I suspect that isn't the case. And the government has to have a role to play in that, from parenting skills, from, you brought a bill, Madam Speaker, about fetal alcohol syndrome. There's education that must be done for women who are pregnant and for couples and expectant fathers on their role to play in the lives of their children. These are things that start after conception, before birth. When a child is born, this government should be doing things from birth to 5 years before they go to school to ensure that they have the services to help that family. We need early childhood intervention. We need early childhood education. We need to talk about the fact that there's money being put into a daycare system in this province, yet we don't know, and maybe we'll find in the budget, but I have a suspicion this government isn't committed to accessible daycare where those children would have the ability to have educational services, have supports that then would, and those parents, so that they would be able to ensure that their children are given the opportunity to succeed in life. These are things that start early in life. And then when we identify those children that are at risk, there's still going to be children at risk, Madam Speaker, but when we identify them, we provide them with the support. We provide them with the mental health services they need. We provide them with the education. We provide them with what they need to understand consequences for their actions, good and bad, Madam Speaker. It starts at such an early age, and yet this government only wants to talk about what we're going to do with 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds who commit criminal activity and the punishments under the Motor Vehicle Act that they will have to incur. Well, Madam Speaker, again, what is this government doing to not only be tough on crime, but be tough on the causes of crime? Madam Speaker, last Wednesday, had an opportunity in my community to have a group called YACPAC, which is short for Youth and Community Partnership Against Crime. And this is a group that we set up in Eastern Passage, Cow Bay, Shearwater area. And we set it up because there's been it's a very safe community. And I think that's important to put on the record. I know in my 7 years as an MLA, I can say, and living in that community since I was born in 1966, that is a very safe community with very, very low crime rate for a community that's larger than New Glasgow or Yarmouth or Bridgewater. But, Madam Speaker, we do recognize that there are no services for our youth in that community, that they have been let down by HRM, by the province, by the federal government. And I was at this conference last Wednesday, Madam Speaker, where they talked about the fact that there needs to be a real understanding that we can't only talk about the punishment, we have to talk about services for youth. Because I remember being involved in the Boys and Girls Clubs. And they used to have a saying back then, I think I've used this in the House before, that adolescents, that youth are at an age where they're going to experiment. The question is, are we going to give them positive experiences to experiment with, or are we going to allow them to experiment with negative experiences that result in criminal activity? And it's up to us to provide them with those positive alternatives that are going to give them a chance, Madam Speaker, to do things that are going to enrich their lives and not destroy their lives and the lives of others. So as a community, what I heard at this conference and the buzzing around that people were talking about, we brought people around from the community to talk about solutions. crime prevention. We talked about what services we needed for youth, the fact that we need a new teen health clinic in the community. We need more recreational facilities, not only organized sports, but also things like, Madam Speaker, things like drop-in center or a skateboard park or a CAP center where they'd have an opportunity to hang out. They need a place where they know they can hang out, be safe, and not be under the influence of others who maybe are going to direct them in a certain direction. I know there's always going to be bad apples, but the question is, how do we ensure that those youth have both competitive and non-competitive recreational opportunities? In a community of 13,000 like Eastern Passage, there are almost none. And we as a community are starting to say, we can't just wait for the government to solve our problems, because God knows this government isn't going to do it. We have to start taking back our community and doing it ourselves, and I applaud the people of Eastern Passage and the committee at YACPAC for doing that. But the fact is, they shouldn't have to do it on their own. There are certain things we can't do. Raising millions of dollars for drop-in centers and skateboard parks and rinks and pools is a lot. We need to know that this government is committed, has a plan with regard to competitive and non-competitive recreational facilities so that our children, our youth have something that they can actually do on Friday nights, on Saturday afternoons, so they have a place to go, a place to hang out. That's all that they're asking for. We just did a needs assessment. YACPAC funded a needs assessment with the support of the Community Mobilization Program, a federal program. And that needs assessment, Madam Speaker, talked about the fact that we have a situation where youth are just saying, we want a place to hang out. That's all. It's that simple. A place they can call their own, put their feet up, not be yelled at, told to move on, where they can put their feet up, they can play music, play video games. Madam Speaker, these are simple things. I see the Minister of Tourism and Health Promotion. He knows full well, as a physical education teacher before he came here, that these sort of things are necessary. And all I can say is I hope that the government is listening enough to understand that the big picture has to be more than just a simple piece of legislation to say we're tough on those criminals. There has to be more for our youth to ensure that they have the opportunities. They're provided with the resources, educational resources, health resources, so that they make proper choices. They're provided with the facilities so that they are able to given opportunities in the community that are positive, not negative. And yes, if there's still criminal activity in those circumstances, Madam Speaker, that they understand that there's consequences for that. Again, as far as this bill goes, I support it, but it goes nowhere near enough. We're just hitting the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that needs to be done for our communities, for our youth, for the people who, like Mrs. McAvoy. She was unfortunate enough to be in a car and having to be driving through that intersection when she was hit by that boy who stole the vehicle and was joyriding, Madam Speaker. But the fact is, we all have to ask why that boy was there, why that boy was in that car. Now, does he understand the consequences? Sure. This legislation, he might think before he got in that car and stole it and said, geez, I'm going to lose my license. I don't even know if he had a license. That vehicle may be impounded. You're going to hear from the member from Sackville-Cobequid who had very similar incidences in his riding. But the fact is, Madam Speaker, that frankly, a lot of what had to be done had to happen years before that boy was 15 and decided to make that choice. Had to be provided with the services, had to be provided with the help. And let's be clear. The mother of that boy has been in the media saying, I cried for help, I begged for help, and no one was listening. And I've seen them come in my office and do the same thing, and when I try and get this government to recognize that there's a need for those services, I don't hear it. I don't see what they're doing. They want to talk about the tough on crime. They don't want to talk about the causes of crime that actually are the result of these crimes. That if that investment was made, we would have better communities. We would have healthier communities. Let's not only talk about criminal activity. Let's talk about the fact today in the paper we talked about the obesity rate in this country for youth. These are all things that are better to the benefit of our communities, for the betterment of our communities. And yet we have a situation where this government continues to not proclaim legislation and allow our schools to be open for free. That we do not have a plan on recreational facilities for our communities. We do not have a plan, investment from this government to ensure that we have more green space while we're planning our communities so that our youth have places to run, to play, to hang out. Well, Madam Speaker, instead, we just have a government that wants to say every piece of land is for sale, put up a house, no tot lots, very little space, no recreational facilities, kids have nowhere to go, they're bored, they end up hanging around with the wrong kids, and we're surprised that this happens? Frankly, the lack of investment of this government and other governments in the past 15 to 20 years in the recreational, educational, and health of our youth is the reason why we have the situation we have today, whether it's swarmings, whether it's vehicular crimes, joyriding, street racing. Again, we're not going to fix all of it, but there's so much that can be addressed. There's so much that could be addressed with a little investment on those causes of crime. And yet this government, this minister wants to talk about the tip of the iceberg. This one little piece of legislation, he's claiming it's going to solve all the problems. Frankly, he was happy to point the finger at the federal government if we didn't say, you got to do more. So instead of, where we said there's a whole litany of things you must do, including this, he said, well, I'll take that. And then maybe the newspapers and the televisions will show that I'm being tough on crime. And everyone will be happy, and everyone can go back to their dinner, and we won't have to worry about it. Well, Madam Speaker, this problem is going to continue and continue and continue, because the Youth Criminal Justice Act is not going to be amended today, is not going to be amended tomorrow, and for all we know, may never be amended. And as a result, we need to look at what us as a province can do to ensure, yes, improving the Motor Vehicle Act is something that I support. Increasing the suspensions for those who commit criminal offenses with vehicles, increasing or allowing impounding of vehicles where youth are involved in street racing. Those are only a tiny fraction of what must be done for our youth. There's so much more. Tough on the causes of crime, tough on crime. This minister only understands half that equation. He's only seeing half the picture, Madam Speaker, and until this government is willing to understand that investing in our youth is not a cost, but an investment that results in a healthier, better educated, higher skilled, and a much better community, a much better province, Madam Speaker. We're going to continue to have swarmings. We're going to continue to have children joyriding, street racing, stealing vehicles, and this minister knows it. And until him and his cabinet are prepared to actually invest in our youth, this piece of legislation isn't going to solve the problem. And he's not being honest with the people of Nova Scotia if he thinks it will. Thank you.
Hear, hear. The honourable member from Richmond.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to say a few comments on Bill 147 as Justice Critic for our caucus, and I'm certainly pleased to see the vast amount of government members that are here to listen to this important debate on their own legislation, and that they recognize the importance of this and the rules of our House on quorum and everything else, and that they take all that seriously. It's funny, we're only in the first week, Madam Speaker, but I digress. Bill 147, as I mentioned before, Speaker, is another attempt by this government, as has been pointed out, the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, to deflect Nova Scotia's concerns about security of our communities, safety of our communities, more importantly, the health and safety of our youth. This is a government which has repeatedly said that it was going to get tough on crime, it was going to make safer streets, and it was going to deal with the issues of crime rates and violence. And what their answer has been with these kind of bills is, let's create more offenses. That's what they've said. Let's create more offenses. At no point have they yet said, what can we do to make investments so that our youth do not commit crime? What services can we offer to them? And that's when the minister made this announcement. That's exactly what my statement was. Why bring forward a bill such as Bill 147 without being able to say, here's a bill, I am creating more offenses, but more importantly, I'm also making this investment in the youth of this province to try to work with youth at risk and try to make sure that they become productive members of our society and that they do not get in trouble with the law. Speaker, this is an issue that our caucus has been speaking on for quite some time. And this government continues to send mixed messages. In one instance, in their blue book, they're going to get tough on crime and everything else, and the Minister of Justice, I'm sure with lots of pressure from the former Minister of Finance, closed down rural courthouses, closed down rural jails, closed the Shelburne Youth Facility, although the Shelburne Youth Facility, I believe, is the responsibility of the current Minister of Finance. I'm sure the member from Shelburne hasn't forgotten him for that, so I think that's who bears the burden of taking out the $1.3 million out of the community of Shelburne. The question becomes, you saved $1.3 million by closing the Shelburne Youth Facility. How much of that money has been reinvested into programs and into services to help our youth? Soon, very soon is the answer from the minister. Well, it's unfortunate. Fortunate for people like Theresa McAvoy that it wasn't sooner than that. It's too bad the swarmings that we're hearing here in the city, that it wasn't sooner than that for those individuals. Mr. Speaker, this government has been very big on announcing plans. They've been big on that. Your Health Matters was supposed to be their plan to fix health care. We know health care is still not fixed, but at least they came out with a plan on that. They had an education summit saying that this was a means of bringing all the stakeholders together to try to hear what the concerns were on education. The question becomes, at what point is this government going to turn its mind and say, we've got serious issues facing the youth of this province, and we need to bring stakeholders together and develop a comprehensive plan. Instead, the Minister of Justice, with his cowboys from Colchester North and Cumberland South, up to Ottawa they go, cowboys up there telling the Minister of Justice in Ottawa that you have to toughen the laws and put more of our youth in jail. Now, what kind of leadership is that? You know, is that Nova Scotia values? Is that what we want in Nova Scotia? To have our Minister of Justice and 2 government MLAs up in Ottawa standing arm in arm, demanding that we change laws to put more of our youth in jail, yet they're not willing to put any money towards programs to assist our youth and try to make them productive members of society. I don't think that's what Nova Scotians want. Yet this government simply does not understand that. Mr. Speaker, this is the same government that when the Youth Alternative Justice Society appeared in front of public accounts, we had to go through the spectacle of watching government members criticizing a government program. The member from Pictou East, I remember, was there criticizing this program, saying alternative justice wasn't any good, and we should take these young people and put them straight in jail. What kind of an approach is that, Madam Speaker? And I think he was mocked enough by the media and by Nova Scotians that it doesn't require me to do that again here today. Because we've moved as a society, and we're now to the point that let us work with our youth, once, if they do get in trouble with the law, to do everything possible to rehabilitate them and to offer them the services required, not only for themselves personally to be able to learn from the error of their ways, but more importantly that they're able to do it within their own community and in many ways give back to their community as part of their punishment and as part of their rehabilitation. So we have moved as a society, and I'm pleased to see that we have done that. And this government needs to continue on that path by making the necessary investments. And I know that the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage raised a number of the points that I wanted to raise, and I can tell you that for the most part, our young people are bored to death. They are. In our rural communities, I'm sure the Minister of Tourism knows that back in Inverness, the size of his county, young people have nothing to do. Once upon a time, in the summertime, there were ball games and that, and young people would come and watch and all that. That's hard to find these days. There's less and less of that going on. There's fewer and fewer places that youth can go, pick up on their bike and bike to and know that they're going to meet young people there, they're going to do some sort of physical activity, or they're going to have a social gathering places. And I'd be curious whether the Minister of Tourism could tell us just how many of those facilities that he has in Inverness. So I can tell you in Richmond County, they're few and far between. And the problem is that in big rural ridings, even though you build one, when you got ridings like Inverness and Richmond, Inverness to go to one end to the next might take you a couple of hours. Richmond's about an hour and a half with our roads. So even if you put one facility, it's tough to expect that kids are going to get on their bikes, depending on where they live in the riding, and be able to attend that facility. And even in his own Department of Sport and Recreation, there needs to be a change in the attitudes as well. The days of building baseball fields for our young people to play on seem to be have passed us, if I could say. More and more of our kids aren't interested in playing baseball. They're more interested in skateboard parks. They're more interested in soccer fields. Soccer fields have certainly grown in popularity. We need to make sure that government is prepared to offer the necessary funding to work with communities and work with young people in the things that interest them. The federal government has tried over the past number of years to put in programs to hire coordinators through HRDC to offer youth programs. The problem is that the funding would only be for so many years and then it would come to an end. The question is, when is this province going to step up to the plate, and rather than continuing to have everyone sit here in Halifax, start putting people out in communities, paid for by the government, to be able to work with those communities, to have the necessary facilities and the necessary programs to keep our youth involved, keep them active, more importantly, keep them safe and keep them healthy. That is what we need to do. And for the government to still not admit that they need a plan to address this, to come forward to this legislature and ask that we make more offenses and saying, well, this is how I'm going to make your community safer and keep our young people safer, I'm going to create more offenses, is just not the approach that should be used, and it's not the approach that's going to bring a long-term solution to these problems. Madam Speaker, I give you another example. Again, this government talks tough. We had the question put to the minister about Operation Shadow. Now, what was Operation Shadow? Operation Shadow was a program that started in Sydney, was later adopted here in Halifax, that would allow police officers to go with probation officers after normal working hours and on weekends, that they could make surprise visits to people who were serving house arrest. Now, the idea, why did you need police? Well, it wasn't reasonable to expect probation officers to go knocking on doors without notice and without any sort of protection or any sort of someone of authority with them. So the idea was, let's have a police officer to attend with them. Let's make sure if you're serving house arrest that you are living up to the conditions. And the minister said it's impossible to assure 24 hours supervision, and no one's asking him to have 24-hour supervision. But when you have cases where you hear of a gentleman that was found in a bar who was supposed to be under 24 hours house arrest, you've got a problem. And more conditional sentences are the way the courts are going. And in Nova Scotia, they really don't have much choice because this government has closed down most of the jails, so there's really not too many places to put them. So while the minister might say on one hand he doesn't like conditional sentences, on the other hand, he certainly hasn't been building any new facilities to meet with his new Get Tough on Crime stance either. So there seems to be a bit of a conflicting message coming from the minister. But what was most interesting, well, the two things interesting. When he answered about Operation Shadow, he said it was cancelled because of the security concerns for the probation officers. Well, that's a bit confusing because the whole idea of the program was to provide protection for probation officers. But maybe he's concluded that even with a police officer with them, it was still unsafe. Yet he turns around and says the solution to this is to ask neighbors of people under house arrest to call us and to report on their activities. So it's unsafe for probation officers, unsafe for a probation officer with a police officer, yet the neighbors should step up to the plate and start undertaking these responsibilities. Now, as I said to the media, Madam Speaker, that may work in rural Nova Scotia. Maybe in Richmond County, some of our communities, if we know someone sits in the paper, someone serving house arrest, then it's a small place. People are going to know about it. They see the person driving around late at night or at the bar, they're going to know that person shouldn't be there. But I'd ask you, Madam Speaker, who represents an urban riding, I'm wondering if on your street and on the streets that you represent, if everyone's aware of who might be serving house arrest in your own riding. And I think the answer is no. And I don't think it's a realistic answer, and I think the minister would know that it's not realistic. And how many people here who live in apartment buildings? I live in an apartment building up here. How many people in apartment buildings are aware that someone in unit on whichever floor is supposed to be serving house arrest? It's just not practical. And it's certainly not any sort of slight on you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that you don't know who your constituents are, but you have a vast riding. And you have a riding that continues to change in its people, and it's certainly there's a great amount of people who live in that riding. And maybe I'm wrong, and you can do like my predecessor, one of my colleagues, Paul McEwen, who used to be able to recite the civic addresses of his own constituents. And if that's the case, then I certainly would repeal my statements, and maybe you do know your constituents as well as that. But I don't think it's something that's reasonable to expect here in this province. We have 70 probation officers that are responsible for supervising over 1,000 files of people who are serving house arrests. 70 people, over 1,000. And we'll get into those figures more, I'm sure, in the weeks ahead. But the problem is that we get so many conflicting statements coming from this government dealing with the problem of crime, and youth justice. And on the final point, when I asked about Operation Shadow, what struck me is that when the minister stood up, Operation Shadow is basically dealing with people serving house arrest. For the most part, they would be adults. Yet the minister gets up, and in his justification says, "Oh well, I've done this for youth crime, and I've invested this money in youth crime." What does that have to do with people serving house arrest? This government is obsessed with the issue of youth crime. And I would tell you, it is not a good obsession. It is an obsession that goes to the belief of members such as Mayor from Pictou East and saying, put them all in jail. That's our response. Well, if they're going to do that, they're going to have to start building more jails. Because there's not really any place to put them. But that's just not an approach Nova Scotians want to see. Nova Scotians want to work with youth who get in trouble with the law and offer them the services to rehabilitate them and make them as to contributing members of society. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we're all aware of people in our own communities that may have been in trouble with the law when they were younger. They've now grown up. They have their own families. Unfortunately, they were given a second chance, and they're now contributing members of society. That's something that we should be striving for. But we won't catch them all. That's the fact. We're not asking to catch them all. But we need to look at a long-term plan for the sustainability of our communities, especially in rural areas, here in metro and urban areas where there's growing populations, to have our youth to be able to attend facilities, programs, activities that will keep them healthy, keep them safe, and keep them as productive members of our society, which is what we all want to see take place. So Bill 147 goes towards more accountability for youth who try to use vehicles for racing. It goes towards putting a greater burden, I would argue, on parents, knowing now that if their child, their son or daughter or their nephew is to take their vehicle and is to engage in racing and in dangerous conduct, that they risk having their vehicle impounded and the family car being put away. So hopefully, and that's a message that regardless of what government does, regardless of what we say as MLAs, at the end of the day, there needs to be also an additional burden placed on parents to accept responsibility for the actions of their children and to do everything possible to try to keep their children out of trouble with the law. And that is difficult, Madam Speaker, because you can have some of the best parents in the world who may still have children who do get in trouble with the law. That is a reality. But this is another step into increasing the importance of parents being aware of their children's activities as much as possible. But I close in stating that until this government starts bringing forward these bills that are not being followed up with an announcement of a greater investment to work with the youth of this province, they are falling short once again. We will continue to have the problem of higher crime in this province. We will continue to hear incidents of our youth getting in trouble with the law, and we will continue to see incidents of communities not having the productive young citizens that we would like to see in there. That is not what Nova Scotians value in this province. That is not what this province was built on, and that is certainly not where we want to see this province go. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this is a really very important issue. I think it's one of the most important issues that that we've had here on the floor of this House so far this session. And I'm hoping that we'll hear a lot of debate about this bill and indeed about the approach that this government is taking to an issue that is of increased public concern here in Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, on the very first day of the House sitting again this session, I introduced a resolution, and I'm going to make reference to this resolution briefly. The operative clauses were about the growing public concern, about the rash of swarmings involving youth in the metro area. It was about the growing public concern of parents, about children's safety in the schools and in the schoolyards of this province where there has been and continues to be bullying. And I also made reference to the concern that the government's response to these problems is inadequate. And there has been a tendency by this government to deflect attention from its own responsibilities to deal with these problems onto looking at the federal government's role, or indeed creating a bit of a vacuum that has meant that municipal governments have attempted, and school boards have attempted to address the issue of youth crime and youth violence by looking at things like fines, bullying fines, and curfews, both ideas for which there is very little evidence of their effectiveness in dealing with these problems. And I called on the government in that resolution, Madam Speaker, to show leadership, accept responsibility for its role as government in youth violence prevention by initiating an integrated province-wide youth violence prevention strategy. And I was very disappointed when government members named this resolution and were not prepared to entertain accepting responsibility. And then shortly after this, the minister introduces the bill that's before us now. I think that the government's response is totally inadequate to what is a very serious problem and one of great public concern. And I'd like to maybe remind people, some people here who may have heard the minister on the radio this morning on CBC Radio, following an interview with a young woman whose name is Sarah McLaren, who lives in my constituency, who is the executive director of the LOVE program here in Nova Scotia. And LOVE stands for Leave Out Violence Everywhere. And it is a program where people who have been victims of violence, who are perpetrators of violence, and who have been affected by violence in various ways, young people have an opportunity to really look for long-term solutions for violent behaviors. And Ms. McLaren raised some very good points and some serious concerns about this government's approach, which is so narrow and so limited in its focus. And the minister came on afterwards and he said, well, we believe that this is the right approach. We believe that this is the way to address violence. Well, I don't have to remind members of the government party that there are people who believe that Elvis is alive, but it doesn't mean that he is alive. And the evidence that is required, I think, to support the government's beliefs that this very narrow approach will be effective is sorrowfully absent. There is no evidence that these measures, in fact, will deal with the increasing incidence of violence. And
I'm finding it a bit hard to hear the honourable member speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I want to go back to the very tragic incident of the death of Teresa McAvoy last fall. And I believe that we as members of this legislature have a responsibility to ask what happened here and what can we do to prevent this from occurring again. It's not a problem.
The honourable member agree to an introduction. Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for giving a moment of her time. I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the Speaker's Gallery. Certainly a friend of this side of the House for sure, and I think all members. And President of the Funeral Directors Association, I believe it's called, of Nova Scotia, and a resident of the Port Hawkesbury area, and certainly a strong advocate for those working on the blue team in my particular area. And I'd ask Mr. John Green to rise and receive the warm welcome to the House.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, every member here in this chamber I believe, was saddened at the tragic loss of life of Teresa McAvoy. And I believe we all take our responsibilities here very seriously in terms of having to prevent another family from having to deal with the kind of pain and suffering that comes from losing such an important person in their lives to a senseless, as a result of a senseless act. And so it may very well be the case that laws around joyriding and the theft of motor vehicles need to be tightened up and strengthened to reflect the seriousness of what that crime can result in, because automobiles are not toys. They are deadly weapons in the wrong hands and used in the wrong ways. But nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, we have to go beyond simple solutions to what are very complex problems. And we must ask ourselves how it is that that young person, or any young person, in fact, becomes so out of control that they're in the situation where they can cause such great harm to others in our community. The Minister of Community Services will know that I have been writing him, for example, with respect to my concerns about the lack of services for youth in our province. My concern that there has been such a profound lack of planning for the implementation of the Young Offenders Act, or the new Youth Justice Act, where we all knew that the federal changes were coming, and we all realized that the outcome of those changes would mean more young people with serious behavior problems, in some cases mental health problems, some cases addiction problems, living in our community without the ability to remove them from the community into detention or correctional facilities. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how did this province prepare for that event? What resources did we allocate? And I'm hearing in my community that we did not prepare ourselves well, and we did not do enough. And the outcome is that we have families who plead every day with social workers, with children's aid societies, child welfare departments, family physicians, and MLAs to get services for young people to help families cope with the behaviors that they simply are unable to deal with on their own. I have yet to hear an adequate response from this government in terms of how they are going to take up this challenge to deal with these problems. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, we really need to look at is we need to look at what kinds of plans this government has with respect to helping parents be the best parents that they can be. There's nobody starts out on the path of being a parent knowing exactly what's in front of them and how to do everything. And often families need help. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's a program over at the IWK funded by the federal government called Family Help. And this program has been operating as a pilot project, a kind of a pilot research project in 2 parts of Nova Scotia. It's been in the Northern District Health Authority region and here in the Capital District Health Authority region. And the idea was to have coaches, have sort of people, a small group of people, I think around 4 or 5 people trained to provide advice to families through a phone line so that at the very, very early stages of difficulties that families were encountering with their children, you know, it might be kids who had attention deficit disorder, and other kinds of behavioral problems, that right at the outset, there be some supports for those families. And families had access to manuals around the appropriate discipline, how to deal with their kids when they act out and they push those parameters. Well, Mr. Speaker, the funding, the research dollars for this program are now gone. And the program, the evaluations are in, and they're being demonstrated to be very effective ways of providing support to families at an early stage. Yet, this government has not committed resources now to make those programs a permanent part of the supports that families can have access to. And we need to ask, why is that? And when will we see adequate supports so that kids don't spin further and further out of control? A child who is completely out of control doesn't go from being normal one day, having good normal behavior one day, to being completely out of control and a danger to themselves and to others the next day. These are behaviors that progress over a period of time, and all of the research indicates this, that there's a progression from much less harmful behavior and acting out to very harmful behavior. What we need is we need to have the ability and we need to have the tools to identify early and intervene early. Mr. Speaker, this bill in front of us today fails to acknowledge that that is indeed what really needs to happen to do justice to preventing the kind of tragic death that occurred for the McElroy family. We need to find ways to intervene earlier and better, Mr. Speaker. The Americans, you know, have for many years been looking at youth violence. They have probably more experience with this issue than any other country in the world. And one of the things that they have found, Mr. Speaker, is that if you approach youth violence not only from a justice perspective, but also in terms of health and wellness, that you actually do more to prevent problems in our young people before they even develop. You get in there early and you do good preventative work. And I believe this really is something that we must encourage the government to do here in Nova Scotia. The justice system is one of the most slowly moving systems that exists in government. Any parent will tell you, and any person who does work around dealing with families that want and need support around how to improve their parenting, one of the very first rules is that you don't discipline a young person, a child, or a youth a week, a month, a year after the behavior occurs. The most effective form of intervention is immediate intervention. If a child does something that they shouldn't have done and the behavior is unacceptable, you correct it immediately. You deal with it immediately. Is this the justice system we have in Nova Scotia or anywhere? Where is the justice system that intervenes and corrects bad behavior, unacceptable behavior immediately? It doesn't exist. This is one of the very real problems that we have if we think that we can deal with youth violence through a justice system, because it is a very, very, very slow-moving system. It's a system where even before a charge can be laid, there has to be evidence, there has to be an investigation before you can even say that was an unacceptable thing to happen. So, you know, to put our faith in a very narrow justice approach to dealing with these serious matters, I think would be very, very foolhardy and faulty. And what this government, in a way, is doing, it's creating the impression that it's taking these matters seriously and it's dealing with them seriously, but it's a facade, really. We have the secure treatment unit in the Truro area, and there isn't much treatment. There's no treatment going on. It's a 30-day assessment process. And during that time, my understanding is that it's very difficult for people to get in there to get an assessment, that quite often there are empty beds in the assessment unit. It's not operating at full capacity. We still have to send young people out of province to get adequate services and treatment, or we have just abandoned them into the community with their families or with voluntary agencies that are unequipped, poorly resourced to deal with this. So I guess we really need to ask the Minister of Justice and Health and Education and Community Services, when are they really going to get serious about bringing in a comprehensive, integrated approach to dealing with what are very serious matters in our community, and stop the piecemeal efforts that have very little evidence attached to their effectiveness, and that really create more of a facade that they're trying to do something than will actually have any outcome. I think that people in this province are ready for a government to really take some bold steps and look at this issue in a much more holistic way that will attack the problem from the early years of when problems first develop in children at a much younger stage, will ensure, for example, that the mental health services that are required are put in place, that there are adequate culturally appropriate services available for families from diverse cultural backgrounds, which, again, from my perspective, representing the constituency of Halifax-Needham, is a very serious problem, and one that I heard as recently as Wednesday night at a public meeting at the North Branch Library, where people talked about the loss of a teen health center in the north end of Halifax. They talked about the difficulties of families in the African Nova Scotian community, in the inner city, getting access to timely treatment and services for their children, and being able to find people who work in the healthcare system, who have an appreciation of the cultural and the ethnic backgrounds of people from other ethnicities. And these are all things that are doable, but you have to, first of all, have the will and the commitment to really take this on. And sadly, I don't see enough of that on the government benches. So I didn't want to take too much of the House time on this, but I did want to lay out a bit more of what I think needs to be done by government to address this issue. I want to say to the government members who are here, I'm extremely disappointed that you weren't prepared to support a resolution that would see a much more comprehensive approach to youth violence happen in the province. And I can assure you that this is not an issue that I or members of the NDP caucus will be moving away from, because it's one that we talk about a lot in our caucus. It's one that we're very committed to seeing some real fundamental change and movement on with respect to public policy. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk about it and have more debate here on the floor of the House in this session. It'll be interesting to see what kind of resources the government is prepared to commit to improving services for children and youth and families in the budget that will be brought forth next Tuesday. And I'm certainly looking forward to scrutinizing that budget to make sure that we do something to reduce wait times for mental health services way beyond what has been done so far, Mr. Speaker. So with those few remarks, I take my seat.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Halifax Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This matter is one that is on the mind of many Nova Scotians, and the matter of youth justice is perhaps on the minds of the McAvoy family more than any other at this particular time, and it's important for us to remember as we contemplate this particular piece of legislation the senselessness with which Teresa McAvoy's life was taken. She is one of many people who have been victims of senselessness at the hands of people who obviously were out of control. I'd like to say at the outset of this, of my comments with respect to this piece of legislation, that I don't find these proposals by the government to be at all offensive. I think that they are in keeping with a reasonable approach to this particular problem, but what I would say is that they lack context. And many of the comments that I'm about to make will echo the fine remarks made by my colleague from Richmond, the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, and the member from Halifax-Chebucto. To think that we are going to fix people by imposing stiffer penalties is the most shallow mistake that we could make in any system of justice. And in Canada, we have repeatedly made that mistake over and over and over and over. And I would urge the government, and in particular the Minister of Justice, to recognize that if all that is intended by this government is to change the penalty sections of certain provisions, then it is the most superficial, shallow, and I would suggest opportunistic response to the great challenges that exist in youth justice. These are supportable initiatives, but they are but a small part of many things that need to happen in our province in order for Nova Scotians to move forward and for our communities ultimately to become safer. At the end of the day, this is about making our communities safer. And we haven't done as good a job in Nova Scotia as we could be doing. It's for a wide variety of reasons. I was interested to hear the member from Halifax Needham, for example, speak about the importance of a timely response when young people in particular get into trouble. As a defense lawyer for many years, Mr. Speaker, I'm quite aware of the challenges that exist in our present system, and I'm also aware of the research that clearly points out that the more timely the response is for a young person, the more effective that response is. So we need to find ways, at the very least, to ensure that the system we have in place provides a timely, effective, and meaningful response. Now, that meaningful response isn't always the big stick. It is sometimes. What we hear more often than anything else from people looking to encourage popularity or to gain favor with the public is that we're going to get tougher. We're going to get tougher on crime is the common mantra that you hear, not just in Nova Scotia, but you hear it all across the country with perhaps the exception of Quebec, and I'd like to speak about that in a moment. The matter of youth justice, Mr. Speaker, is something that I have spoken and written about for a long period of time. And what I would urge the government to do, most of all, if they're interested in communities becoming safer, is to follow the research and not just respond with a visceral reaction to every single incident. To thoughtfully consider what is going to make the communities in Pictou East or in Truro Bible Hill or in Cumberland or in Yarmouth or in Cape Breton or in Halifax safer. Because if we repeat mistakes of stigmatizing young people and just pretending that by getting out a bigger stick we're going to make it better and playing into people's fears and increasing the civic disengagement that we have around this problem, then we're going to continue to face the same problems, and we're going to have these insidious problems with respect to swarmings. And we're going to find ourselves with communities that don't feel safe, especially for seniors, to walk down. I'd like to provide some context to all of this, Mr. Speaker. Back in the early 1900s, Canada introduced the Juvenile Delinquents Act, and for a period of time it served many purposes. It operated under the phrase parens patriae, which meant that it was a parental type of piece of legislation. There were strong components to the Juvenile Delinquents Act, and there were weak components to the Juvenile Delinquents Act. One of the strongest components is that there were often community responses when people came into conflict with the law. And it meant that for many young people, once they did something wrong and the police intercepted their activity, the response was a community response. And the involvement of families was central to whether or not the problem was ultimately resolved. The problem with the Juvenile Delinquents Act is that it was applied unevenly. And sometimes when young people were stigmatized, they were kept for very small charges, like shoplifting, for endless periods of time because the parenting at home wasn't at a standard that was acceptable to the community. So ultimately, particularly with the onset of the Charter of Rights, it was obvious that many of the protections that young people enjoyed in other countries weren't being realized in Canada, and we needed to revise the Juvenile Delinquents Act, and in came the Young Offenders Act. The first discussions about the Young Offenders Act emerged in the 1960s, but it wasn't until the mid-1980s that the Young Offenders Act, that has since been scrapped, was brought before Canadians. And we all know what happened to the Young Offenders Act. It became a particularly maligned piece of legislation. Now, nobody's going to pretend that the Young Offenders Act was a perfect piece of legislation, but let's consider a few things just for a moment as we reflect on the question of punishment and balance in all of this context. No country incarcerates young people more than Canada has historically. For 8 of the 9 most common offenses, young people are incarcerated more than adults in Canada. Now, I see the puzzled look from some of the members across the way when I make reference to those statistics, but that is a fact of the research with respect to what exists in Canada. The fact of the research is that no country in the Western world processes young people through the system more than Canada has. So as we begin again another chapter of criticizing a piece of legislation which isn't a perfect piece of legislation, and some members in the House would appreciate that I had some involvement in advancing some parts of the initiatives under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, let's make sure that we strike a balance. The balance, I would suggest, involves ensuring that we follow the research as well. When the Young Offenders Act, which did have problems, was ultimately replaced by the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the intention of the new act was to treat more serious offenses seriously and to ensure that we find a more constructive response to the problems of youth crime, particularly at the low end. And for Canadians, we might consider ourselves to be a soft touch in relation to the rest of the world, but the research clearly suggests that Canada has been processing young people through courts more than any other Western country, and has been throwing young people in jail more than any other Western country. So as a result, let's take a pause for a moment and consider how can we effectively bring about meaningful responses.
Order. I wonder if the member would allow for an introduction.
Sure.
Thank you. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, and thank you, member from Halifax City. I'd just like to bring the attention of the House to the West Gallery, and in it tonight we have Deputy Sheriffs Tammy Robertson and Daniel Ray. If they could stand. These people are here just to bring awareness of their cause, and hopefully the House can give them a warm welcome tonight.
Indeed, welcome to our visitors. The honourable member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The point that I want to make about our responses with respect to youth crime is that the focus needs to be on making our communities safer. What is it that is going to make our communities safer? And as much as we may like the red meat of punishment, sometimes that's effective and sometimes it is not. And for people to say that the only response that's going to be effective is a stern response and that the Canadian system is a soft touch, they clearly don't know what they're talking about and don't appreciate the full consequences of what a meaningful response could be. So what we have with the Youth Criminal Justice Act is a movement toward treating more serious offenses seriously and recognizing that there can be more community responses in the way that the Juvenile Delinquents Act provided for more community responses. What Canadians may not have been ready for is the weight of what this act has created on the social services network in our country. Clearly, if the Youth Criminal Justice Act was intending to divert more people out of the system for lower-end offenses, particularly nonviolent offenses, the question that needs to be asked is whether or not the community is ready to accept them, whether or not we're prepared to provide the responses like some of the responses that the member from Halifax-Needham has referenced with respect to mental health, and the ones that were commented on by the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage with respect to sport and recreation, whether or not we as a province in Nova Scotia have the network of responses that are able to catch and support young people who are at risk. Here's the sad truth about it, Mr. Speaker. Prior to the Youth Criminal Justice Act coming into place, the social safety net for young people at risk in Nova Scotia was more fragmented than perhaps in any other country. And what we have found is that the agility required in order to ensure that that social safety net gets tightened hasn't been entirely there. And I'm not going to suggest that the whole problem rests on the shoulders of the provincial government. It obviously rests with the federal government as well. If the federal government's going to put a piece of legislation in place to ensure that young people are going to be moved for low-end offenses from the formal system to a less formal system where there are more effective responses, that it needs to ensure that in cooperation with provincial governments, there need to be the resources in place and the time needs to be taken to ensure that all of the agility required by health, justice, education, social services, and all the players in between come together to provide effective, creative, meaningful responses. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened in the way that it could potentially have happened. And we're now starting a new cycle of criticizing the legislation and thinking that this legislation is causing the whole problem, instead of looking at the harder questions. It's always going to be easy for a provincial government or for a minister of justice to say that the problem exists with the legislation, and ladies and gentlemen, people of Nova Scotia, I'm going to make it better by making things tougher, and that's going to fix it. The truth is that it's, in some circumstances, that is effective. But in many circumstances, the problems go deeper. And in a province where the social safety net, as the member from Halifax Needham was pointing out, is already in challenged circumstances, we need to provide more meaningful responses over time. So my invitation to the Minister of Justice, who is not present here today, is to come forward with full and complete responses about how over decades, over generations, we're going to begin to address the problems of youth crime and make our communities safer for a more lasting generation. What we find is, and I hear the member from Cape Breton Nova concurring with some of the comments that I make, and many of us would be familiar with his experience in this area and ensuring that young people are kept busy, out of trouble, and involved in recreation opportunities. Those are the types of things that ultimately are going to have a long-term impact on whether we can walk in our community safely and whether we feel safe. Because right now, the simple responses aren't necessarily working. When I was a young person, my father was a sports broadcaster. He used to sign off at the end of all of his sports broadcasts by saying, "And remember, parents, when your kids are into sports, they're out of trouble." Well, that's absolutely true today, just as it was many years ago. And it's not just about sports. It's about whether you're involved in arts, whether you're playing chess, whether you're hiking, whether you're skateboarding, whether you're doing a variety of things that weren't done many years ago. What we need to do in Nova Scotia is ensure that our young people are active and engaged. And what do we find? Well, we find the population of young people in in Nova Scotia to be one of the least active of all populations in the entire country. Mr. Speaker, we have about half as many people involved in sports as the province of Saskatchewan, young people involved in sports, as the province of Saskatchewan that has the same population as us. Now, how many of us are proud of the achievements of our young people? How many of us are sending our young people off to sports and feeling like our teams are engaged and they're competing on a national scale? Well, the truth is that because we don't emphasize activity in sports, because we're not ensuring that we have the facilities in our communities, as the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage pointed out, we're going to find ourselves with communities where there is a vacuum of inactivity. I went down to and appeared in courts in different parts of the province, and I was always struck by the number of places in Nova Scotia where young people were involved in break and enters because they didn't have the kind of facilities that they need. I know that the member from Eastern Shore would certainly appreciate the importance of having facilities in the Eastern Shore because there are enormous challenges in the Eastern Shore with respect to having facilities for young people to ensure that they stay out of trouble and they're involving themselves in meaningful consequences instead of finding themselves at the Duncan Macmillan High School again getting in trouble once again. We have challenges throughout this province, and the only way for us to have lasting solutions and ensure that we are not going to find ourselves in a terrible cycle is to recognize that the solutions to youth crime, the solutions to making our communities safer rests in more challenging circumstances than just increasing penalties for young people and pretending as if that's going to take the whole problem away. When we look at a snapshot across Canada, I think it's clear to say that there have been some jurisdictions that have provided significant leadership. If one looks at the work that's been done in British Columbia, for example, in realigning the services that they provide to young people at risk, by realigning entire departments around the question of whether or not young people are going to continue to be at risk, it's clear that we could be doing better. If you look at Alberta, it's clear that we could be doing better. And especially if you look at the work that has been done in the province of Quebec, it's clear that we could be doing better. Now, in places like Nova Scotia, I think it's fair to say that the preponderance of opinion is that the Young Offenders Act and the Youth Criminal Justice Act were too soft on young people. I think it's important, as we put all of this in context, to appreciate that in Quebec, they feel quite strongly that the Youth Criminal Justice Act is a hard-nosed, too tough, edged piece of legislation that goes far too far. as we strike the balance of what's most effective for Nova Scotia young people and our Nova Scotia communities, I think it's important for us to look to places like Quebec and examine whether or not some of the responses that they've provided, some of the more holistic responses that they've provided through community services are ultimately making a difference and providing for lasting effects where people come together. Because, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, the stigmatizing of young people isn't about a piece of legislation. At the end of the day, the challenges we're talking about are related to our relationship to each other. How committed are we to each other? How much do we care about the well-being of our neighbors' children? There was a highly acclaimed book written a number of years ago by Robert Putnam, an American author, called Bowling Alone. And he spoke about the insidious problems that happen through social disengagement. What he was arguing quite effectively is that we're involved less in neighborhood meetings. We're involved less in social clubs. We bowl less together. We're involved in political organizations together less than we were before. In short, our commitment to each other has weakened and our social cohesion has been dropping. And we always expect for the professionals to do the job for us. Well, it's not the job of the professionals to raise our children. It's our job to ensure that our young people are provided with positive reinforcement, to ensure that they are provided with role models that are positive, that they have opportunities to do the things that they do best. There's research out of McMaster University that says that suggests that for young people who are in trouble, the most important tool, far from jail, the most important tool to putting them back on the right path is to find out what they do well. And if that's standing on their heads or doing tiddlywinks or playing hockey, then give them that opportunity. And once they find their self-esteem and that opportunity, then things start to happen for them and they pull themselves out of the trouble that they're in. We should follow that research. We should look for every opportunity we can find for the young people who are at risk in Nova Scotia, to give them an opportunity to do what they do best. If we don't, we're failing them. And we're failing all of those seniors and all those people in Nova Scotia who want and deserve for our communities to be safer than they presently are. This is a larger question than just what penalties we apply to one small piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. And as a province, there's a broader response that we can provide than the one that's being presented right now. I invite the Minister of Justice and this government to come forward with a comprehensive plan that recognizes that youth justice and youth crime is not just a matter of increasing penalties, but instead it is a matter that involves a comprehensive social response in conjunction with the responses that we have through our formal system. I've seen young people learn their lessons in court, and I've seen young people learn their lessons through responses that are provided through the social agencies across this province. What we need to do is ensure that the simple responses, the knee-jerk responses that have pervaded Canada and Nova Scotia don't continue with a broader consideration of the long-term ramifications of that. If we want to simply get tough, as people have described in the past, then let's just look to the United States, see what they've done in creating an industry with incarceration, and then see that they have one of the most violent domestic societies in the entire Western world. It might make us feel good, but the responses obviously are more comprehensive than that. There is a place for increased penalties. This piece of legislation is obviously a supportable one. I think it is in particular supportive. It is appropriate for a province that has faced the challenges that it has with a number of crimes involving people who are traveling in cars that are stolen. And it's appropriate that this measure be approved and ratified, but I would urge in the strongest terms this Minister of Justice and this government to start doing the harder work related to youth justice, recognize that this is associated with education, health, social services, and a wide variety of issues that have for too long been neglected in this province. I support this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to it going forward to second reading, and I look forward to listening to the comments that are coming forward from members of the government and members of the official opposition.
Thank you. Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Here, here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's important, I think, that a lot of the members here express the opinions of many of the residents they represent, and that's one reason why I'm going to stand tonight and have a few comments about this proposed legislation. As many of my colleagues on both sides of the floor and on government members caucus support this bill, and as I do, I support the intention of this bill to address some of the issues around youth justice and especially crimes that are committed with the use of motor vehicles, Mr. Speaker. It's been a topic well discussed in my community, well discussed in the media and across this province, with some high-profile cases recently involving deaths of Nova Scotians. And especially when it pertains to the people involved were younger people of our province. The thing that concerns me, Mr. Speaker, reading through this bill and being a new member and my new experience at looking over proposed legislation is that this is a pretty easy read, Mr. Speaker. When you take off the cover of the bill, Bill number 147, there's only 3 pages pertaining to this bill. And the last page has 8 lines on it, Mr. Speaker. So really 2 pages of proposed changes to an issue that is extremely important to me, extremely important to the constituents I represent, and I think extremely important to all Nova Scotians and all members of this House. And I applaud the efforts by the Justice Minister to include some changes, especially when it pertains to the use of vehicles, as I said earlier, in those young offenders that use a vehicle in committing a crime, and increasing the penalties and possibly the fees incurred when charged, and also increasing the ability to hold those vehicles, increase it from 1 hour or 24 hours to up to 30 days if it's a second offense stated in the bill, Mr. Speaker. But as many of my caucus members have stated, and the member from Halifax Citadel has stated, that the problem here isn't just those individuals that commit crimes with vehicles, and we need to hopefully try to make it known to them that the province and the people of this province aren't going to stand youth doing crimes with vehicles. There's a lot of issues around what we need to do and what the government needs to do to address this issue of youth justice in our province and youth crime. And I would have hoped that this bill would have been a lot thicker and harder for me to understand, Mr. Speaker, not coming from a legal background, but coming from a background in healthcare. I would have hoped that I could have seen a piece of legislation that I would have needed maybe some of my colleagues to help me interpret. There's a lot of issues in my community, especially around the use of vehicles and speeding, especially down our main drag in Sackville, on Sackville Drive. It's well known that we do have a problem out there, and there's always criticism given on why this type of thing happens, Mr. Speaker. You do have to put the onus, I believe, a lot of the times on the reason behind some of the crimes committed by our youth on parents and the family structure. And I take full account of my own children, and I know my wife and I discussed this several times with young kids, hoping that our children will not participate in crimes in the future and get off track on what our youth should be doing and what their participation as a society should be, Mr. Speaker. There seems to be, not all, but many youth today that I think are more educated, especially when it comes to what they can get away with, what the law actually states, and what government and what police can actually do to them after they commit a crime. It's amazing to see some of the attitudes with the young and the youth in our communities, and I want to emphasize that I'm talking about a small portion of the youth, because there's many youths, and the majority of them live their lives abiding by most of the rules and laws of our land, and aren't categorized in that group that I'm talking about. But there are many individuals, many youths who find themselves on the other end of the law, Mr. Speaker, and I've witnessed it as a paramedic over the years, going to many calls, especially pertaining to vehicles and high-speed chases and stolen vehicles where they come down and have no regards of safety, no regards of what they actually are doing, and we really need to look at this. We really need to address the issues. I understand that this is not just something we can fix overnight. This isn't something that just the provincial government can fix. But I think all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and especially federal, need to seriously look at what is happening to our youth, what is happening to their attitudes, or how they're getting these attitudes of that they can do whatever they want and get away with it. I do believe that there should be some stiffer fines, stiffer sentencing to our youth when it comes to repeat offenders. Those individuals, as we've seen in some of the cases that we have witnessed over the last several months and the last year here, especially in Halifax, they just don't have any regards of the law. And these individuals, we really need to have an avenue for our police officers in this province and for our legal system to address those concerns that many residents have about convictions or penalties that these youth have to endure after sentencing. And really, a lot of people have called my office and said that they're upset with how the sentencing has gone over the years with pertaining to youth and youth crimes. And a lot of the issues, like I said, stems back to what do they do in the community? What is there for our youth in the community? One important area, which I know the member of Halifax Citadel mentioned, was sports, Mr. Speaker. Sports plays, I believe, an important role in the fight against crime in our communities when it pertains to youth. Keeping them active in sports and giving them the opportunity to try different sports, I think is a great avenue and a great possibility to address this serious issue that we are seeing here in the province of Nova Scotia. But sports, and I know sports was important in my life growing up, and I'm thankful at a young age that there was some of my mentors that were involved in sports. Recognized that maybe I would be a good candidate to try to entice to get into different sports, and I truly am grateful to many of those individuals who helped me along the way, and I think really kept me out of trouble and kept me active, and that's the most important thing I think with the youth today, is to keep them active in our communities, because when you have kids have nothing to do and they get together in groups, and we've witnessed the swarmings that we've seen in Halifax here, they have nothing to do, they're bored, then they tend to break the law, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure you're well aware of this as your former career as a police officer, witnessing youth and other criminals when there's not much to do in communities, especially small communities in this province. That's when I think they turn to the side of breaking the law. Sports definitely is an important avenue we need to look at to hopefully deter these youth from...
Order, please. Member allow for an introduction. Definitely. Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Community Services on introduction.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I appreciate the opportunity. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the Legislature, we've just been joined by somebody who is no stranger to this chamber, but it's awfully good to see him back, Tim Olive from Dartmouth, former Minister.
Certainly welcome our guest to the gallery today and hope he joins the proceedings. Welcome, Mr. Olive. The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I did mention, like I say, sports is an important, I think, avenue that we need to look at and recognize as an area where we need to address, especially funding. Mr. Speaker, in my involvement with track and field over the years when I was younger, I remembered attending the Canada Games back in 1989. And at that time, Mr. Speaker, I didn't pay for a thing when it came to me representing my province in Saskatchewan. And to my astonishment, Mr. Speaker, as a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee meeting, we had the members from the Legion and Nova Scotia New Command coming to our committee asking us where they could find funding to pay for the uniforms to the young athletes that are going to represent our province this summer in Manitoba. And I just couldn't believe this, Mr. Speaker. And I have to give it to, at the time when I was involved in track and field and representing this province across the country, when the Liberal government was in power, I have to say they did have a lot more money going into sports. Sport Nova Scotia has been cut dramatically over, or their funding has been cut dramatically over the years, Mr. Speaker, and it's been this government that cut their funding. Athletic Nova Scotia has been cut and have limited amount of money, Mr. Speaker, and I just can't believe that. And they stand and wonder why there's problems in our community with youth, and I think they need to really look at what their priorities are when it comes to youth justice in this province and really start funding youth initiative programs. Sports is one, and the arts in our schools, Mr. Speaker. Not all students in our school system are involved in sports. I was fortunate enough to be involved in that, but not all are. And arts and culture in our schools are the first target to government cuts, Mr. Speaker. We're hearing it today from the school board, especially in the Halifax Regional Municipality, about cutting or not even wanting to deal with the arts programs in the schools. And what message is that sending to the youth, Mr. Speaker? That government and municipalities don't care about what our students are doing. Many of these programs involve the students during school, but most of them involve students after school. And it's keeping them busy, Mr. Speaker. It gives them somewhere to go. It gives them a talent. It broadens what they can do in the future. And it keeps them active, like I said, Mr. Speaker. And I think by keeping them active, it is a great avenue to reduce what we see in our province when it comes to youth crime and criminals amongst our youth, Mr. Speaker. One of the other avenues we need to look at is investing more money in mental health and what resources are available to our families and to our communities when a family recognizes at a young age, a lot of them, and I've dealt with it in my own community. I was helping one family, Mr. Speaker, who had a behavioral problem with their sons. They tried every program in the province. And Mr. Speaker, I won't name names, but this young gentleman was the first resident of the new secure treatment center in Truro. Everybody was looking forward to this center to be open, to allow some of our problem children in this province to go have an avenue to hopefully get some treatment and come out of that facility and back into the communities. But Mr. Speaker, it's really just a secured facility in Truro. This young gentleman who I dealt with, his family, pleaded for help with this government, pleaded with the Minister of Community Services, and you want to know where that young youth is now, Mr. Speaker? He's one of those numbers of our young Nova Scotians that are shipped out of the province to receive treatment, Mr. Speaker. And I just can't believe that in this day and age that we cannot care for our own youth and have them in Nova Scotia and receive treatment when there's definitely identified a problem with behavioral or any other issues that they may have, Mr. Speaker. And it was a real...
Please. The honourable member like to move adjournment debate?
definitely, Mr. Speaker. I'll have more comments when we resume, so I'll move to debate.
Motion to adjourn debate on Bill 147. Agreed? Agreed. The Honourable Government House Leader on tomorrow's hours and order of business.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow the House will meet at 9 a.m. and sit to approximately 12 o'clock, at which time we will adjourn for the weekend. The order of business will be public bills for second reading, and we'll be doing any of the bills on the order paper from 147 on. I'll speak to the two opposition House leaders, Mr. Speaker, about what bills we can get through tomorrow, because I'd like to have law amendments going on Monday. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I move we now adjourn.
Motion as the House adjourned to 9 a.m. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. We've reached the moment of interruption. Call upon the honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley. Oh, the honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'm honored to rise here tonight, Mr. Speaker, to speak on this issue about moving liquor stores out of the small downtown areas of the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as you heard yesterday here in the legislature when I asked a question to the Minister of the NSLC and also the Minister of the Economic Development, Mr. Speaker, and